Okay. Um, Hello, everyone. I want to thank you for joining the New America Fellows Program for this discussion of Jason Zengerle's new book, Hated by All the Right People, Tucker Carlson and the Unraveling of the Conservative Mind. My name is Phil Bennett, and like Jason, I was a class of 2023 New America Fellow. You've heard some of the housekeeping. About the bottom of the hour, we'll open it up for questions, and I'll repeat the instructions about how to submit your question. And you can also buy a copy of the book, which I'd highly recommend. And it's available through the book-selling partner of New America, Solid State Books. And you should see a link on the page you're looking at with instructions about how to do that. So now I'm going to give Jason a brief introduction. He's a staff writer at The New Yorker covering politics, and he was a contributing writer to the New York Times Magazine, and previously worked at GQ, New York Magazine, and The New Republic. He's the winner of the 2019 Toner Prize for Excellence in Political Reporting, and a former fellow of mine at New America. Jason, I just want to start by congratulating you on this important book.
Oh, thanks. Thanks a lot.
And for our friends and colleagues in the audience, I thought that whether you think you already know Tucker Carlson or you think you don't want to know Tucker Carlson, this book will persuade you otherwise. It just has so much that feels new and important in it. And I wanted to start in the now. The book reveals, I think, very persuasively that Tucker over the last quarter century has been such a successful shapeshifter that his trajectory mirrors and in some cases influences a lot of the changes that we've seen in the media and in politics over the last 25 years, especially the conservative media and politics. Um, but if you were to explain to someone today unfamiliar with Tucker Carlson why he's important now, how would you describe him?
Technically he's a podcaster, right? But I think he wants to be much more than a podcaster, and I think he is bigger than that. And I would say he's not even really a media figure anymore. I think of him as more of a political actor at this point and
Mhm.
almost a movement leader. He obviously has this platform, which is his podcast. It used to be Fox News, but he's using it for things that are more than just, getting eyeballs and views and the money that comes from that. He's really trying to shape our politics and shape our country. And he does that in part through the Trump administration. He has, a very close relationship with the president. He has an even closer relationship with the vice president. And he's weighing in, behind the scenes on policy, on personnel, all of these things. But, I think beyond that, in the public space, he's articulating a coherent ideology that he is trying to gain converts to, and he's doing that, 3 or 4 days a week. And it's more than just entertainment. I think he has a more serious purpose in mind, and I think he and I mean the thing about the book, like I really wanted to take him seriously and kind of
Mhm.
subject him to the sort of scrutiny you would subject a political leader to, and because I really think that's the way you need to think of him at this point.
Great. Well, we're going to get to, ways in which he may be influencing the politics and the conversation in the country and what that coherent point of view might be. So now let's go back then a little bit towards the beginning. So, one of the animating questions that you ask at the beginning of the book, and you're channeling others who you know, is what the hell happened to Tucker Carlson? And implicit in that is that he wasn't the person at the beginning that he became later in life. So take us back to when you meet him in the 1990s. Who was he then? How does his story start?
So I first encountered Tucker in, I think, 1997. I was an intern at the New Republic magazine. He's only a few years older than me, but he was, light years ahead of me career-wise at that point. He was working at the Weekly Standard magazine, and he was, I think probably like the like the hottest young writer in Washington at the time. He was a terrific magazine journalist. I mean, really, really good writer, excellent reporter, and a courageous one because within the sort of the conservative media world, and I think this happens on the left as well, but I do think there was a real reluctance sometimes to go after prominent figures, kind of sacred cows, and Tucker did not have that. He wrote very critically of Grover Norquist, who at the time was, I think probably the most important conservative activist in Washington. He wrote a profile of George W. Bush in 1999. At that point, Tucker had kind of graduated to Talk magazine, which Tina Brown had left the New Yorker to found Talk. And so they went out of business not too long after that, but it was a pretty prominent publication. He wrote this profile of Bush that, it wasn't a hatchet job, but it was very sort of subtly and kind of deftly, dissecting him and conveying all the things about him that would prove to make him such a bad president, kind of, the callowness, the stubbornness. Um, and Tucker just, he was a guy who seemed to be on a path towards, like a David Brooks path or something. And David Brooks was one of his colleagues at the Standard, and you could sort of see Tucker, who at the time was only in his mid-20s, sort of graduating to the Times op-ed page at some point, and just kind of becoming this, this figure who occupied that space in our politics. He was really, really good.
Yeah, I mean, you say that, in another era, he might have continued to aspire to be Tom Wolfe, Hunter Thompson, that kind of
Yeah.
thing, but he wasn't in that era. And so you describe that, and this is not the first time, not the last time this happens in his kind of boom and bust career, that he sees something happening in the media a little bit before some others do, and he starts to move in a direction that eventually others will follow. So he goes to television. And so how does that happen?
Well, Tucker, he I think one through line throughout his whole career has been this desire for, fame and power and money to a certain extent. And I think he recognized that print was not going to provide that for him. So at the same time that he's writing all these articles for the Weekly Standard and elsewhere, he's also doing some television. And television has really changed at that point. Cable news is really changing because Fox and MSNBC have come online and they need to fill airtime. And one of the ways in which they fill it, CNN, is also there, but CNN has like this worldwide reporting network, like they're actually kind of reporting the news. It's really expensive to do that. Fox and MSNBC realize like we can't really afford that. So one thing we're going to do is we're just going to talk about the news. We're just going to have people on who can just talk about what's happening, kind of reacting to events. And previously, journalists who went on TV to talk about politics tended to be folks who had spent a lot of time covering politics, like the David Broders of the world. Like you needed to kind of have some experience, some bona fides to graduate to television. But when Fox and MSNBC come on, and CNN starts to do this as well, you just will take anyone who's kind of, glib and camera ready and quick on their feet. You'll have him on. And Tucker was perfect for that. I mean, he is a very good talker. He is, very confident. He can opine on anything. And he started getting more and more of these hits on cable. And I think he recognized he would spend all this time reporting these stories for print magazines, sweating them, sweating the writing, sweating the details. And they would, some of them would make a big splash, some of them wouldn't. He could go on a cable program and say something off the cuff, and a cabinet member would call him the next day to say, "Hey, I was really interested in this thing you said on CNN." So he decided to go full time into cable news. CNN hired him. He was the youngest anchor, I think, in the history of the network at the time. And he was pretty soon put into one of the most prominent places on the network. He was given the on the right chair on Crossfire. Crossfire was kind of this venerable political debate show that was on CNN for a long time, and important people occupied that chair. And he was given it at I think the age of 29 or 30, and that was going to be his new role.
Yeah, there's some grumbling at the beginning that he's not conservative enough to occupy that chair, and Crossfire for those who can recall it, seems positively quaint now in its kind of Marquess of Queensberry rules of debate, but that experience ends kind of dramatically and ignominiously for him, and I'm sure people on this Zoom know what I'm talking about, but describe what the Jon Stewart moment is with him on Crossfire.
So there was a critique was building up about Crossfire among, political people, media people, that it was play acting, and it was a very hackish debate show, and Tucker was representing the conservative point of view, and I think he would really had to toe the party line. He had to toe the Republican Party line, and I think it was sort of like political hacks, just kind of debating about the issues, and then afterwards they would all be friends and they'd go off and get dinner together. And Jon Stewart had been making this critique on his own show, The Daily Show, and really, lambasting shows like Crossfire in particular. Crossfire invited him on, and I think the producers at Crossfire, and I think Tucker himself, who was actually kind of friendly with Stewart because they used to share smoke breaks outside the CNN studios when Stewart was there to do Larry King. I think Tucker thought Stewart was in on the joke, that Stewart was criticizing Crossfire, but it was the same way, Tucker would criticize a liberal position and the liberal host, Paul Begala, would criticize a conservative position. Stewart wasn't joking. And Stewart came on and he just, he absolutely went at Tucker and went at Bagala in a way that you don't really do in that kind of environment. He didn't pull any punches. And he ridiculed Tucker for wearing a bow tie. I mean, he called him a dick, like on
Mhm.
air. And Crossfire had a studio audience at the time. And I mean, the thing that was, I think, so painful for Tucker is the studio audience took Stewart's side, and they're cheering him on as he's taking a hammer to this show. And it was such a just a devastating performance that the new CNN president, like a month later, decided to cancel Crossfire. And in his statement, sort of announcing its cancellation, he said, like, I agree with Jon Stewart. And Tucker was a casualty of that. He lost his contract at CNN. And, it
Yeah.
was when you look at sort of the inflection points in his career, like this is definitely one of them because, I mean, the public humiliation he suffered and the sense that he had it, and I don't know if this is entirely accurate, but he felt that his friends in kind of the clubby world of DC media and DC politics did not come to his assistance in a way he would have liked them to. And I think that planted kind of a seed of resentment that has, really blossomed over
Yeah,
time.
well, it's notable because even though Stewart, his critique might have been a performance of its own, the accusation is, the one that goes viral is, you're hurting
You're
America.
hurting America. Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
it really is a more than, it's a pretty deep cut. So that's great, because we could stop there on the media side for a moment and go to say what's going on inside his head politically, because around this same time he begins to move away from the neocons, from the Weekly Standard view of things, and the catalyst for that is really Iraq,
Yeah.
that he so describe you have to put it in a nutshell, but he moves radically on Iraq, and he does it before other conservatives do.
Yeah, he had harbored some private doubts about Iraq and about the wisdom going into war there, which he suppressed. And publicly, he was a cheerleader for the war. And, look, in a way, he had to be. His job at Crossfire was to be the Republican representative or the conservative representative. And so the show doesn't work if the guy on the right is saying, yeah, I'm not so sure about this. So he was banging the war drums. But he had these private doubts. And then, I think very much to his credit, he recognized the disaster that Iraq was and was going to become much sooner than pretty much every other conservative pundit. And he voiced it. He went to Iraq in late, God, I've lost track of time at this point. What, 2023? Like 9 months into the war, he did a story for Esquire, saw it for himself, came back, said, this is a disaster. I'm embarrassed that I ever supported this. He publicly disavowed it. And more than just kind of, giving this public disavowal, like I think he really, kind of admirably grappled with, why had I been wrong about this? Why were other people wrong about this? And he really started to reevaluate, I think, his entire kind of worldview. And he reevaluated the people that he looked up to. He was a fan of Bill Kristol, who had been his mentor and editor at the Weekly Standard. He was a fan of John McCain's. And I think he started to wonder, like, okay, what else were these guys wrong about? And, conversely, he started to wonder the people who these guys had held in such low regard, someone like Pat Buchanan, who was obviously, an America First guy, isolationist, was very opposed to the Iraq War. I think Tucker started to wonder, okay, like, what else was Buchanan right about? And it prompted him to reevaluate all sorts of issues and all of his views on them. And one of the really interesting things to me in doing the book was after he left CNN, he went to MSNBC. And I didn't watch the show at the time. I don't know who did, but if you go back and you look at the transcripts, you really start to see the changes he is going through, like in that show on issues like immigration, on issues like free trade. He
Mhm.
starts articulating a much more, paleoconservative Buchananite line, even back then, which, I think the common kind of perception of Tucker is that he started taking these, paleoconservative views only after Trump came along, and that actually is not the case. He was saying these things, as early as 2005, 2006. It was a complete reversal from where he was before when he was at the Weekly
Yeah.
Standard. He was pro-immigration, pro-free trade, just kind of conventional Republican views or conventional kind of mainstream conservative views. He was
Yeah.
starting to switch already, and I think that really came out of Iraq.
Yeah, it's fascinating because the book really lays the groundwork for why Trump and Carlson connect the way they do later on when he's at Fox. I want to stop for a minute on the Daily Caller because there is another interesting moment in this evolution where Carlson goes to CPAC, conservative, convention. And he says, we need a New York Times of the right. We need to be responsible. We need to report facts. I mean, it almost is kind of it's a very strange, speech to contemplate today. But that's where he's at this moment where he goes into online journalism, and he's going to try to start an online news source that is going to be maybe a little bit like the Huffington Post or whatever. So it's going to be conservative, but there's going to be serious journalists working there, et cetera. And it doesn't quite go that way, right? Because because he makes a discovery about how successful a site like that can be, and Breitbart and Drudge and others are already out there. So what happens during that daily caller period that helps set up where Tucker goes next?
So yeah, you're exactly right. He gave this famous 2009 speech at CPAC where he, went into CPAC and started praising the New York Times, which, is not going to be well received in that kind of environment. But that was the point. I mean, he knew he was going to get booed and heckled, and it was a Sister Soldier kind of thing. Like
Mm.
he was speaking to an audience outside that room. And because he,
Mm.
in that audience would view CPAC heckling him as something in Tucker's favor, right? And he had this whole kind of spiel about how you need to be accurate. And if your media organization isn't devoted to accuracy and facts, it will never succeed. And he was able to raise a good amount of money and he was able to hire a pretty talented staff with this idea. And I think it was an idea that he sincerely believed. Like I don't think it was cynical on his part. But he recognized very early, just by looking at web traffic numbers, that after the site launched, and it launched to great fanfare and a lot of support from the DC kind of clubby political world. I mean, if you there's like a fantastic sort of time capsule, like the launch party that had in 2010 at Juliana Glover's house, who was sort of like the preeminent Washington social hostess, and like Jake Tapper and David Frum and Christopher Hitchens and all these people are there to celebrate it and celebrate Tucker, who's returning from TV to the world of, sort of serious journalism. And after the high of that went away after like a week or two, the numbers, the web traffic they just completely cratered. And he recognized that, there was not an audience among conservative media consumers for that kind of approach. And he pivoted quickly, and the site pivoted, and they started doing, more kind of sensationalist, tabloidy stories. And then eventually they started doing more really kind of just hard right, anti-immigration, fear-mongering about black crime, those kind of stories, because that was what the audience wanted. Those are the stories that people clicked on. And what it did for Tucker politically is it gave him sort of a radar about where the conservative base was and what base conservative voters thought and what they wanted, which was complete. It was, the exact opposite of what I think the Republican establishment and kind of mainstream conservative commentators thought they wanted. Because at the same time that Tucker's seeing these, really kind of like nasty, racist articles, about immigrants are appearing on his site and doing fantastic numbers, you have Republican politicians talking about how the party has to moderate on immigration and they have to move towards the center. And that's what the only way we're going to, Obama's president, and like the only way we're ever going to win the White House again is if we take the party in this more centrist, moderate direction. And Tucker is seeing that like that's actually not what the voters want, or at least the audience wants. And I think that preps him for Trump in a way that other conservative pundits, other conservative commentators were not prepped.
So then you have this incredible convergence where Tucker goes to Fox as Trump is coming into view in a way. He gets his own show right after Trump is elected. Is that the
Yeah, so Tucker goes to Fox, and Tucker goes to Fox as, it's like the NBA equivalent of like a 10-day contract. He's like
Mhm.
a total bit player. It's the only cable news network he hasn't worked at that point, and they kind of like bring him on, pull him off the scrap heap. They give him this job where he's anchoring the weekend Fox and Friends, their morning show, and the week, I mean, if you think like weekday Fox and Friends is stupid, like weekend Fox and Friends like goes beyond that. And he has no connection to sort of the world of politics or intellectual arguments or anything there. Like he's driving a go-kart on the studio set. He's doing cooking segments with Billy Ray Cyrus. For a guy who is quite smart and has certainly has intellectual pretensions, and I think they're legit. It's humiliating, but he
Mhm.
does it anyway. He does it with a smile on his face because he really wants to stay in TV. So he's kind of hanging on by a thread doing that. And then Trump comes along and he announces his candidacy in 2015. And I think this is probably hard for people to even conceive of today, but in 2015, Donald Trump is not taken at all seriously by the pundits at Fox and by Rupert Murdoch himself. They view his campaign as a sideshow, a distraction. I mean, Charles Krauthammer, who was probably the most famous sort of intellectual conservative pundit on Fox, basically starts talking about how Trump is, he's like a liberal dirty trick because the mainstream media is going to pay attention to Trump as a way to discredit Republicans.
Mhm.
And that's kind of the consensus at Fox. And Fox, though, has a problem because they want to cover Trump. They need to cover Trump. Roger Ailes, who runs Fox, knows that Trump is good for ratings, but they need someone to go on air and give like sort of at least like if not the pro-Trump view, at least not bash him. And there's no one who can do that because like there are no, I mean, one producer, a former producer was like told me, it was really hard to find like a camera ready human being who could make like a coherent argument for Trump. But Tucker, because of his experience at the Daily Caller, when Trump announced, Tucker saw the potential there that I think
Mhm.
others did not. Like he saw that there was going to be a lane in the Republican primary for a nativist candidate running on white grievance in a way that I think no one else did, or very few else did. And he was able to use that insight to start getting more airtime on Fox and be liberated from, Fox and Friends weekend, started getting on better shows, other shows. And, eventually the rest of Fox obviously came along. But his foresight was not forgotten by the end of the campaign. And when Roger Ailes got fired because of the sexual harassment scandal, Rupert Murdoch took over things, and his first move as the new interim CEO was to promote Tucker from Fox and Friends Weekend to this primetime evening show, weekday evening show,
Yeah.
and that happened at the exact same time that Trump was elected.
I mean, there's just so many interesting parallels in their rise, his rise from sort of go-kart guy to, as you say, the host of the highest rated cable news show in history, right? Which is what that Tucker Carlson show became on Fox. This enters into a super interesting period. It's a really interesting part of the book too, because Tucker is, let me see, something's happened with my screen here. Anyway, Tucker has this platform. He's channeling Trump in some way, but he's also keeping his distance from him. And you write, remarkably that Trump is calling him on his phone. He's letting the calls go to voicemail because he doesn't want to get that close to him. What is why is he doing that, and what's the relationship like there?
I think he had personal qualms about Trump. I think he was skeptical. He liked what Trump was saying. He liked the arguments that Trump was making, but he was a little wary of Trump himself. And I think one, I think he just found Trump like kind of fun and interesting, but sort of distasteful at the same time, and not necessarily didn't have the personal qualities you would necessarily want in someone who's president of the United States. I think he was also worried about getting too close because he thought that anyone who got too close to Donald Trump, things ended badly for them. And so while the rest of the Fox lineup, the primetime stars, like they loved having access to Trump. Sean Hannity became such a frequent presence at the White House, either physically or on the phone, that staff referred to him as the shadow chief of staff. They were always talking to Trump off air. Tucker really resisted that, and like you said, would sometimes let Trump's calls go to voicemail. But the thing that Tucker realized was he actually didn't need to talk to Trump off air because Trump was watching his show every night, and Tucker could just talk to him through the TV screen.
Yeah.
And at a certain point, not, like 6 months, 9 months into the show, I think he kind of recognized that he could actually drive policy by what he said on his show. And so the show, clearly he cared about ratings. He wanted people to watch, but he also started to program his show with a mind towards, what do I need to say or do tonight to get Donald Trump to do this tomorrow? And so he's a very good writer. And he started to spend a lot of time on that opening monologue, could sometimes go like 10 or 15 minutes. And he would deliver it, straight to camera. But I think he was thinking Donald Trump is watching this. Or he would book guests, who he knew would have a message that he wanted to resonate with Donald Trump, and he would have them talk about things that he wanted to influence Trump on. And a lot of times it was personnel. Like he would, if Trump was thinking about appointing to someone to a position and Tucker didn't like that person, he would do a monologue attacking them, or he would have a guest on who would attack him. And number of times, like it worked. I mean, Elliot Abrams was going to be Undersecretary of State. Trump, Tucker has Rand Paul on to talk about how much he hates Elliot Abrams and to talk about how Elliot Abrams was opposed to Trump during the 2016 election, wrote a really negative article about him for the Weekly Standard. Next morning, Trump was like, "Yep, Rex Tillerson, you can't have Elliot Abrams as your deputy." He did that a number of times, and
There are
he
even more bizarre examples. I mean, you write about, I mean, I didn't expect to read the sentence. More than once, he helped stop Trump from launching an imminent military attack.
yeah, no, Tucker's a real believer in
Mhm.
um in in isolationism.
Mhm.
He does not support military adventures, and Trump, says he doesn't, but he obviously kind of does. It depends on what the
Mhm.
situation is. And at the same time that you had Fox, at the same time you had Sean Hannity saying, we need to retaliate against Iran for this shooting down our drone. Tucker's on saying we can't do this. It's going to lead to World War III. And Trump is watching both shows, and I guess Tucker's argument was more persuasive in the end because Trump had that he had battle plans drawn up, airstrike drawn up, and he backed out at the last minute.
Mhm. This is where, at this point, you write that Tucker, and you said this in the opening, that, he's articulating a more coherent view of populism, of nationalism than, Trump himself. So let's dig down a little bit. You talk about isolationism. What are the other elements of that really start to come out during this period?
I mean, certainly immigration. He is a hardcore immigration restrictionist, and he wants uh, a country that is less diverse. I mean, for lack of a better word, that's whiter. Trump sometimes wants that, sometimes he doesn't. I think it depends on the day. I think Tucker is more hardcore on that. Certainly when it comes to trade and things like that, he's more anti-free trade than Trump is sometimes. When it comes to crime, I mean, Trump is obviously, he wants to crack down on crime. I think he and Tucker actually align fairly consistently there. Using the government as a tool to harm or at least police your opponents, your political opponents. That's something I think that Tucker supports as well, and I think Donald Trump supports too. So it's the ideology eventually sort of gains this title, national conservatism. That's sort of
Mhm.
where that's the title they all kind of eventually settle on. And Tucker, in a lot of ways, becomes the figurehead of it because the thinkers and the writers who subscribe to this, they kind of have like reverse engineered this ideology to match Trumpism. And but that's a problem because Trump himself doesn't necessarily believe it. And I think it can be kind of it's hard to have him as the figurehead and oftentimes humiliating because like he'll say something that completely contradicts this thing that you supposedly believe or these tenets. And Tucker in some ways becomes like a substitute for Trump because he's not gonna, reverse himself necessarily the way Trump always did.
So, there's the substance and then there's the style. And, even the title of your book, talks about, hatred. Hatred is a kind of leitmotif that runs through not just, Tucker, but Stephen Miller, J.D. Vance, people he identifies with and supports and feels kinship with. Where do you describe a little bit about how Tucker is even more enthusiastic about attacking Trump's enemies than he is about supporting Trump. But there is this kind of just, uh, violent rhetoric, idea of of having enemies, of hating them. And just curious where you think at the end of your project that comes from. What feeds that?
I think there is a lot of resentment that Tucker harbors, which in some ways, like he shouldn't, right? He's had a charmed life. I mean, he's obviously had his, professional struggles, but everybody has professional struggles, and we all have setbacks. I mean, his setbacks occurred, on national television. I guess maybe that's harder, but he really, I think, he's always been anti-PC, anti-woke. I mean, that's not new. That goes back a long time, but the the hatred of elites, which he for the longest time was a member of good standing of the elite club, and he was someone that they all liked. I mean, he played this kind of really sort of interesting role in the Washington, kind of political and media ecosystem where he was like the invited skunk at the garden party. I mean, he was the guy you would have over to say, literally have over to your house for a dinner party to like say kind of like the outrageous thing that all of all of your like liberal friends and neighbors would disagree with, but it was still kind of funny, and you would have him to like liven things up. I mean, not actually unlike Donald Trump probably in New York social circles, kind of playing a similar role. But at the same time, I think Tucker, because of his, his maybe his career struggles, I think he felt that this elite wasn't really giving him the the things he was due in terms of like a prominent spot on television or kind of a place, in the intellectual kind of firmament that maybe he felt he was deserved. They didn't really fully appreciate his talents. And I think that bred a resentment in him that when Trump came along, it really kind of bloomed into full flower. And
Mm,
at the same time, I mean, the flip side of it is Tucker, I think, recognized that in a lot of ways, your success in politics and in media was driven more by who disliked you than by who liked you. Because if you get attacked by people that a certain group hates, like that attack kind of validates you in this group's eyes. And so having liberals criticize you and say you're horrible makes you more popular with conservatives.
mm,
And the title of the book, Hated by All the Right People, it's a line that Tucker said himself. He was in Budapest visiting Viktor Orban. It was, I mean, to the extent now like that Hungary and Viktor Orban is like at the center of American conservatism. Like I really think a lot of that has to do with Tucker because he went to Budapest for a week on Fox and did like an infomercial for Orban, which kind of introduced Orban to sort of mainstream conservatives in the United States. But Tucker, during that visit, there was a dinner at the prime minister's residence, and Tucker gave a toast and to Orban, and one of the things he said was, "You are truly hated by all the right people," and
mm,
that's like the highest compliment you can pay. Basically, you have the right enemies, and I think
mm.
Tucker has, he that is sort of like a guiding, sort of I don't know, theory for him in terms of how he operates.
After 2020, and we're at the bottom of the hour now, so I'm gonna ask a couple more questions, and then I see that there are questions in the queue, so I'll go to those and I'll remind people how to do that. I'll do that right now. You can go to a Q&A function to the right of the Slido box, which neither Jason nor I can see. And I guess you can put your question there and then it'll pop up on our screen and I'll read it. Um, we have this slide into conspiracy thinking, conspiracy theory, and it's quite dramatic, actually, starting in 2020. Carlson makes this film about January 6th, and it seems in your telling that this kind of begins a cycle where he just starts to get further and further away from you know verifiable fact. And so describe what his take on January 20th is, because it also evolves. And then try to explain to us what this really this kind of conspiracy furnace that he's now stoking, where that is created.
I think like everyone who was like alive on the day of January 6th, like anyone who was living in the world of shared reality, like he was horrified by it. And he I mean on a personal level, like he has a son who was working on Capitol Hill for a Republican congressman at that time, and he was in he was on the Hill, and I think like he was worried probably personally for his son's safety. I think he blamed Trump for what was happening. He, was very clear-eyed about Donald Trump. I mean, he took it very like personally. There later on in this Dominion voting systems lawsuit against Trump, or I'm sorry, against Fox, all these text messages were released as part of discovery, and text messages that Tucker was sending at the time, he calling Trump a demonic force, and he couldn't wait to be done with him, and he never had to cover him anymore. Um, as after January 6th, when it became kind of clear that, you know, Fox's viewers maybe didn't find January 6th as horrible as Tucker and others did, he started to lessen his criticism of Trump for it, and he started to try to sort of soft pedal January 6th, and actually what happened, was it really as bad as people said it was? And then like he started to go further than that. And it was more like, well, maybe it was really bad, but it wasn't bad because of Trump supporters. It was bad because this was a government op. This was a
Mm.
federal op. And there was a conspiracy theory. Look, conspiracy theories are gonna, rise up around anything. There was a conspiracy theory on the far, far right that January 6th had been caused by federal agents who were in the crowd and were provocateurs and were, urging these nice, peaceful Trump supporters to become violent as a way to discredit Trump and as a way to discredit the Trump supporters and as a way to steal the 2020 election. And Tucker started to kind of, sort of in little bits and pieces, would sprinkle that into his show, and it grew and it grew. And the thing that Tucker is very good at, and I use good not like in a normative sense, but he's successful at, is he is able to take really fringe ideas and theories and stories that often exist, in these like weird places on the internet. And he takes them and he reframes them a little bit, makes them a little bit more palatable, gives them maybe a little bit more gloss. And he would bring them onto his Fox show at the time and present them to mainstream conservative viewers in a way that, was kind of convincing. And, I think in the end, with January 6th, he winds up producing this three-part documentary that makes this argument that January 6th was a federal operation, a government operation, the deep state basically running this, and as a way to bring repression onto right-wing conservative Americans. He basically says like the way we conducted the war on terror abroad in Afghanistan, the helicopters are coming back to the United States, like really kind of dark stuff, but he did it in such a way that I mean, I think like, I mean, I hope like, you and me were watching it and we're like, this is nuts, but not everyone responded that way. And looking back on it now, his view of January 6th, which seemed kind of crazy at the time, like I think that's like the mainstream conservative view of January 6th now. And I really think Tucker look, there are a lot of different conservatives kind of promoting that eventually, and he was not the only one, but I feel like he sort of put forward the most, kind of I don't know, coherent, like internally consistent take about that first. And I think that drove a lot of the thinking on it. And that's something that, he continues to do. It's a very dark conspiratorial worldview, obviously. And I think hopefully people can see that. But at the same time, like Tucker, he doesn't present as crazy. Like
Mhm.
Alex Jones says this stuff, and Alex Jones is a nut, right? So you kind of like you factor that in to taking the message from him, like you discount it a bit. Tucker does not come off like a nut. He is a very credible looking, credible sounding person, and he's got his his rep tie and his Rolex, and he's just like this guy's just giving it to you straight. And I think he gives these ideas and theories like a degree of credibility and validity that most people who promote them in the past do not bring to those. And I think that that's kind of what makes him, dangerous, because he's able to make this stuff seem not totally insane.
Well, you're really describing too, and how anti-Semitism enters the picture here with Carlson. His interview with Nick Fuentes, the white nationalist, happened after your book was finished, but you've written about it in the New Yorker a little bit. So take us into the anti-Semitism piece of it, and where it comes from, how it expresses itself.
Yeah. It's a great question, and it's one I've been thinking about a lot. When I wrote the book, this stuff was present, and there's stuff about it in the book. But if I if I'd written the book 6 months later or finished the book 6 months later, I think I would have had more because it's become so central to Tucker and so prominent. I was talking to a person who knows him very well and who likes him, but I think disagrees with him on questions about Israel and Jews. And I was sort of trying to get a sense from this person, like what's going on here. And then this person said that, Tucker, the reason he started talking about this and the reason he started fixating on it was because he he's so mad at people like Bill Kristol and the people he used to work with at the Weekly Standard. He's so mad at the neocons, and Israel is so central to the neocons' identity that it was a way to poke at them. It was, he would say critical things about Israel to kind of troll them and to make them, uncomfortable and upset, and that's where it started. And maybe, it was almost just kind of like a cynical ploy on his part, or just something that he was directing at this very small group. I think it's clearly become bigger than that at this point. And I think it has kind of taken on almost like talismanic quality. It's so central to so much of his thinking. And he will often say, like, I don't want to talk about Israel. But then Israel is this through line through everything he talks about now. It comes up in the strangest places. Obviously, there's, a long history of anti-Semitism on the far right, long history of anti-Semitism in nationalist movements. Maybe it was inevitable that he would come to this, but he clearly, I think, believes this stuff at this point. I mean, the Fuentes incident was really, I think, kind of fascinating because I assume people who are watching this, like, know that he had Nick Fuentes on his podcast back in late October last year, and it prompted this, kind of amazing kind of fracture within the MAGA movement and within conservatism. Fuentes is an avowed white nationalist. He's a true white supremacist. He's a neo-Nazi. Like there's no getting past that. He pretty much owns up to that. Tucker had taken a bunch of shots at Fuentes on his show. He called him a Fed, which is like the worst thing you can say about someone in that for far right space. He said Fuentes was like a gay little kid living in his parents' basement. And Fuentes, he fired back at Tucker on his show, and they were sort of going back and forth at each other on their various platforms. They were having this feud, and Tucker, I think, realized that he was losing, that Fuentes's fans were taking Fuentes's side, and they were really attacking Tucker. And Tucker, I think, has made the calculus that you can't be successful in conservative media and conservative politics these days unless you have the support of neo-Nazis, basically, that you can't lose those people. And so he invited Fuentes on his show as like an olive branch, basically. And he conducted this very, soft interview with him. And I think that was his way of trying to diffuse this situation because Tucker's very good at like skating to where he thinks the puck is going to be. And I think right now he thinks that the future of conservatism and the future of right-wing politics is one that's going to involve these far right, far right, neo-Nazi types, and that he needs them. And so I think some of the anti-Semitism or objectively anti-Semitic arguments, some of that stuff I think has to do also with appealing to this audience.
Hmm. Hmm. Maybe that brings us a little bit to talking about some of the other people in his orbit. And before we do that, I do want to, I don't know, neither Jason nor I know who's on this Zoom, but we can imagine and that some of you have questions. So please submit your questions. And you can do that through a box that you can see that says Q&A on it. So we have about 15 minutes left, and I would urge people to join the conversation. Um, You raise at the end of your book, other people have raised the potential that Tucker Carlson becomes a presidential candidate in 2028, that he's got big political aspirations. He's also, very close to JD Vance, and he and Vance have this, relationship that I haven't seen fully kind of excavated, but you do some of that in the book. So maybe start a little bit about how did Tucker and JD Vance get going, and then maybe bring us into Tucker's relationship with Trump today, because it's different than it
It's
was
very
when he
different.
was
Yeah.
sitting in the Fox chair.
I think JD Vance owes his political career to Tucker. I mean, more than Peter Thiel even. When Vance was running, Tucker and Vance met not long after Trump was elected. They were speaking at like a bankers conference. At that time, Vance is the Hillbilly Elegy author. He's sort of considered like the Trump whisperer or the Trump explainer. He's the guy, everybody's shocked that everybody in, sort of the two coasts is shocked by Trump's election. And here's JD Vance, this, nice Yale law grad who has written this book about his hard scrabble upbringing in Appalachia. And he can explain to us how these people in flyover country, why they voted for Trump. And so he's at this conference kind of doing that. Tucker at this point has, he hasn't gone full populist at Fox yet. People on Wall Street still like him. He's a familiar figure. He's at the conference as well. But I think they both, experience like a genuine like discomfort and in some ways like revulsion at the people who are at this conference, like the Wall Street types. They don't like it. And they share that, and like they're the only two people there who share it, and they recognize it in each other, and that sort of that forms like the an initial friendship between the two of them. And then when Vance decides that he wants to run for office and he starts changing his shape from a Trump, he called Trump like a Nazi, I think,
Mm.
at the time. He starts changing his tune on Trump because the only way you can win in Republican politics is to be for Trump at that point. Tucker provides him a huge boost by having him on his show all the time. I think among Ohio Republican primary voters, Tucker's show on Fox has got to be the most watched program. So just having that platform is a big boost to JD Vance. And then, like, even more importantly, behind the scenes, and this is like one of these rare instances at that point, at least, where Tucker actually is willing to engage with Trump off air. He goes to Trump privately and really lobbies hard for Vance, who, had said a lot of negative stuff about Trump. And so Trump wasn't entirely sure if he wanted to help this guy, and lobbies Trump to endorse Vance in the Senate primary, which Trump ultimately does, and I think is really the difference in that primary. I don't think Vance wins that primary without Trump's endorsement.
Mm.
So JD Vance owes that election to Tucker. And then in 2024, when the vice presidential selection process was going on again, Tucker privately goes to Trump and along with Don Jr. and some others, is saying you need to endorse Vance or you need to pick Vance, and that I think proved to be a fairly big factor in Vance's selection. I mean, Tucker and JD Vance are right now and have been for a while, like in complete ideological lockstep. I mean, so much of
Mm.
Vance's politics, I feel like, is a reflection of Tucker's, and in terms, I mean, not only just sort of what he said, what he believes, but what he says and the form in which he says it. I mean, during like his Senate campaign, his direct to camera ads like were so similar to Tucker's monologues that
Mm.
he would do on Fox. Like same issues, same message, same language, and it was really striking. Um, and right now, in JD Vance, like Tucker has this great vehicle because I don't like when there's a question of like, will Tucker run for president? Like he's not like Bill Clinton. This is not some office he's wanted since he was, 12 years old. I don't think it's probably an office he particularly even wants, but he does have, a vision for this country that I think he wants to see achieved. And Vance right now is the vehicle for that because Vance, seems to have the same vision that Tucker has. They share this. And I mean, the only way I could sort of see Tucker ultimately running would be if JD Vance starts to, diverge from Tucker, if they're no longer in lockstep. I think the second way it could happen, and I think this would probably be the more likely one, would be if Tucker came to the conclusion that JD Vance doesn't really have what it takes to be elected president. He's just not a talented enough politician. And he, therefore Tucker won't be able to achieve this vision. I mean, at that point, like maybe he could find someone else who is a better politician who, agrees with him, and that could become the vehicle. But if he can't find that person, if that person doesn't exist, then I could completely see him doing it himself. Just because, I think in his heart of hearts, he probably would like to just remain where he is now, and he can be in Maine and Florida, and this JD Vance can do all the stuff for him. But I don't think he wants to just kind of be a podcaster. I think he has bigger ambitions than that.
We have a question about how you would assess Vance's chances in 2008 were you to assess them today.
It's interesting because I was talking to some like sort of Republican people lately, and people who really like Vance, and they all talk about these are people who don't like Tucker and do like Vance, and they're all worried about Tucker's bad influence on Vance, and Tucker's leading Vance to a place that he's not going to be able to recover from, and he's not going to be able to win election if he goes too far with Tucker. And it makes JD Vance seem like this kind of he doesn't have his own agency in this. He's not an independent actor. I think Vance has made the same calculus that Tucker has made. And the way Vance has handled Fuentes, I think, is a real reflection of that. Vance in 2024, Nick Fuentes has said like the nastiest stuff about not only about JD Vance, but about JD Vance's wife, who is, Indian American. I mean, like he refers to her with a racial slur. He questioned Vance's, support for white identity because of who he married. He harps on the South Asian name that Vance gave one of his kids. And it's really gross. And in 2024, when he was asked about that, he said, that guy's a loser. I disavow him. When he's asked about Fuentes today, he dodges the question, and I think that's very similar to Tucker having Fuentes on his show and making this sort of peace gesture. Like he doesn't want to lose Fuentes's fans, and so I think Vance thinks that that's the way to go.
Mm,
In terms of like his natural political talents, like I think there are very good reasons to be skeptical of those.
mm,
He's not a natural Paul. The thing about Trump, like Trump is entertaining. He's charismatic. Even if you don't like him, I think you have to acknowledge that JD Vance just kind of comes off as angry and awkward. And I
mm,
think that I think that will not bode well for his future prospects as a presidential candidate. But I think the ideological question and the thing that people around him are worrying about, and not his inner circle necessarily. I think the people in his inner circle are, comfortable with this. Why would they stay with him if they're not? But the people who are a little bit removed, the way they fret about the JD Vance Tucker kind of alliance, I think is just strange because I think JD Vance is quite comfortable with it. I don't think Tucker is a bad influence on JD Vance. I
mm.
think I think they influence each other.
Yeah. What is as you look at the news, you say, well, a much more interventionist approach to the world than Carlson might have, endorsed, earlier. And then you also see Minneapolis, and I do not follow him closely enough to know what he has said about Minneapolis, but where is he on ICE and that?
So, credit here to Tucker Carlson. After Renee Good was killed, Tucker, I thought, was one of the few conservative, or MAGA pundits who actually like had like a decent human reaction to it.
Mm,
He wrote a thing for his newsletter, saying like I'm sure I disagree with Renee Good about immigration, but like this person should not be executed in the street, and this is a horrible thing. It's a very low bar, but a lot of people didn't clear that bar, and he did.
mm,
It's funny. Someone asked me about the Minneapolis stuff just a couple days ago, and I didn't know the answer because Tucker hadn't weighed in on it. But just a day ago, he finally did an episode, which I listened to yesterday, and he shifts the focus. I mean, he's not cheering on ICE for executing American citizens in the street, but he is trying to change the focus and put the blame on the protesters who are, you know, radical anarchists. He's basically saying like they're bringing this chaos they're bringing it to Minneapolis, and they're going to bring it to your cities next. And if we don't sort of draw a line here and we don't stop it, this is going to become America. We're going to have a civil war because these people, they're not necessarily protesting against ICE. They're protesting against just order in civil society. And it's a and and I think like even he said something like they are against Christians and they're against white people. So I'm probably getting the exact phrasing wrong, but he injected that into the argument, and it's a little. I mean, it's a little. It's it's just a way of like changing the focus. And he's not going to explicitly defend masked ICE agents, but he's going to try to shift the attention and the blame to these other people and make you be scared of them and make you want to do combat with them.
Mm. In your work going ahead, I mean, we've kind of ended up in this tough place. I mean, the end of your book is tough. And part of that is that one of the most savvy and successful diviners of the public mind and spirit, at least on the conservative side, is getting more and more extreme and more out there. And even what you're describing about, you have to have Nick Fuentes on your team if you want to be serious on the right. Boy, that seems like a hard position to dial back. I mean, what's your sense now about whether or not this has become a kind of, permanent or a kind of cul-de-sac for people that's going to be very hard for either the Republican Party or conservative movement to get out of?
It's really, yeah, it's so difficult to see the way out of this, which is so depressing. And you look at like the 2028 sort of, Republican primary, and you look at a guy like Ted Cruz, right? Who is, kind of like really sort of like staked a flag against Tucker Carlson and against JD Vance and against blood and soil nationalism, right? And it's like he's like the only one. I mean, I think he's going to be the only candidate, the only presidential candidate who really makes kind of a stand against this stuff. And
Mm,
when Ted Cruz is your best hope for this to not become the dominating view of the Republican Party, that might not be the best position to be
mm,
in because I think and I look, I credit to Ted Cruz like for doing that. I mean, but at the same time, he's not always the best messenger. And
mm,
I think that, Tucker over the last like decade or so has really been proven right in a lot of instances. And he'll say something that seems like nuts and you think it's going to cost him. And then it turns out it doesn't. And, in the book, I write a little bit about Joe Sobran, who was this
mhm,
very, prominent political conservative writer. He was William F. Buckley's protege, really excellent writer, smart thinker. He eventually kind of runs off the rails and goes further and further into kind of anti-Semitism and racism. And at a certain point, it becomes so bad that, Buckley fires him from the National Review and he's excommunicated from the conservative movement and kind of excommunicated from polite society. And when Tucker was a young writer at the Weekly Standard, he used to joke with people. He would tell a joke about how he ran into Joe Sobran at a suburban Denny's outside of Washington. And, Sobran's like, he's unkempt. He's got like long, dirty fingernails and, long hair. And he's sitting in a booth and he's holding court. And there's no one there. He's all by himself, and he portrays him as this like madman. And Tucker, I think, it's very tempting to say that he's followed the same path as Joe Sobran, and I think he has in some respects, with the one crucial difference that he has not been excommunicated. And the crazier and crazier he gets, the more and more influential and the more central to our politics he becomes, because there really are no safeguards anymore. Institutions are not capable of putting up guardrails to stop someone like Tucker or to stop someone like
mm,
Trump. And the crazier Tucker gets, I think the more central he becomes. Like that's a a very bad place to be in. And but I really do worry that is a place that we are in right now, and we are headed. And it's I hope there's a way out of it, but I don't it's not readily apparent to me what that is.
mm. Jonathan Katz is asking whether or not you have heard from Tucker. Has he read or commented on your book?
He is not, so far as I know. And yeah, I actually don't know. I mean, when I started the book, I went to him and, asked, I told him I was doing the book, wanted to talk to him, and we went back and forth about whether he would or not. He said that Fox probably wouldn't let him, but he wanted to, but Fox wouldn't let him. And, then after he got fired from Fox, I said, Fox isn't stopping you anymore. But he didn't ever really reply to that. So yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure what his thoughts are on it.
Well, you still have more stops on your tour. You never know.
Yeah,
And
that's right. Maybe he's in the
uh,
Zoom audience right now.
yeah, well, this has been a great conversation, Jason. Thank you, and thank you for the book, and
Thank you.
good luck with the rest of the the effort to get it out into the world and find an audience.
Nah, thanks. This has helped a lot. I really appreciate it. And I really appreciate everything New America has done during the book process, the writing process, and now this as well. Thanks.
Great.